patrons, welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial series. So in the first part I went through how you can decide what to include in your sketch outline, and so I drew on a reference photo to really show you how to pick out things that you want to include in your sketch. So if you guys want to watch that, then make sure you check out that part. It was in the last video that I did. And so in this part I want to kind of tackle another common question that I get all the time, and that is, what do you look for when you're deciding what paper to use, and what recommendations do I have for certain types of paper for different types of mediums. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the 4 things that you should mainly look for when you're choosing your paper. I'm going to go through some examples of what paper I like for each different type of medium, and also go into more detail about those 4 things that you need to look for. So okay, got my sheet of paper. It's going to be like a little lesson today. So if we start with paper in the middle. So when we're deciding what paper to use, this pen is not great. So the first thing that you need to look for when you're deciding what paper to use is how thick do you want it. So the thickness, the GSM or the pound weight of the paper. Okay, so part 1 is the thickness. So that will be indicated by the GSM of the paper, so grams per square meter, or it'll also be by the pounds, so the pound weight. So this will depend on what you want to use it for. If you're using watercolors, then you might want it to be thicker. If you're using colored pencils with solvent, again, you might want it to be thicker. If you're using any type of wet medium, you'll probably want your paper to be thicker. If you're only doing a sketch or you're practicing, then you can get away with thinner types of paper. My rule of thumb is that I like to stick within sort of 200 GSM, or what's mine, or between that and like 300 GSM, which is about 140 pound. So that is the weight of my watercolor paper, and that's kind of what I like to use no matter what I am drawing. I just like to have thicker types of paper, but it's up to you. I just like it being a bit more substantial, a bit more sturdy. So I'm just looking through some of my papers to see exactly what weight they are. So mostly they are 140 pound paper. Some of my papers for coloured pencil do go down to about £100, which is still pretty decent. So I would go for £100 to £140. And that's if you want some paper to be really thick. £140 is better if you're using wet or mixed media. So overall, I would say that for watercolours, you will want your paper to be quite thick. You'll want heavy paper, which will mean that you want it about £140, which will be the standard, which is about 300 GSM. And these numbers are displayed on the front of all of the paper, so it's really easy to find out the weight. And this just means that they're not going to warp really easy or buckle, and they're not just going to be really thin where you can see through it. So try to go for something a bit thicker, and this will also make the paper take colour or graphite a lot better. So thicker paper takes darker graphite, and it makes the darker values darker than if it's really thin, because it can hold more of that product. So again, thicker paper can hold more of the medium. Thicker paper can hold more graphite and coloured pencil. / coloured pencil. God, this reminds me of when I used to teach and I always have to write loads of stuff on the board because I used to be a maths teacher. Well, like intervention. So it really brings me back to those days. So yes, thickness is super important, and it's the main thing that I actually look for. Thickness is the most important thing to me. Even if it's an amazing type of paper, if it's too thin, I don't use it. I don't even consider it, because for me, paper is quite fragile as it is, so I don't want it to be really thin. I would rather pay more and get it thicker than I need it to be. So the second thing that I look for, so that was number 1. The second thing that I look for is the texture or the finish. So what I mean by this is the texture smooth? Has it got a bit more sort of rough feel to it? So if you want to do portraits, and in particular if you want to do like coloured pencil portraits, graphite portraits, then you might want a smoother finished paper. If you're doing sort of watercolour work and you want that texture to show through, that kind of gritty or really textured bumpy look, then you might want to go for some more rougher textured paper. So smooth types of paper is often your like Bristol paper, your Bristol pads, your Bristol finish paper. And if you want your really textured paper, this tends to be for like watercolors, like cold pressed watercolor paper is really good. So go for like the cold pressed watercolor paper. And what's good about watercolor paper is that you don't just use watercolor paper for watercolors. A lot of people use watercolor paper for coloured pencil, graphite, charcoal, obviously watercolor. You don't just have to stick to what the paper says it's used for. So even though it's watercolor paper, use it for your coloured pencil, especially if you're using solvent with coloured pencil. I'll always opt for a watercolour paper over a Bristol paper, because when you're using solvent with coloured pencil, it's more like you're doing a painting because you're using the paintbrush, you're adding wet sort of mediums to it. So opt for something like a watercolour paper over your super smooth Bristol paper that you'd use for portraits. So for smooth, you might see it titled as smooth paper or plate surface paper. So that's what I use a lot for my portrait drawings, is the plate surface finish paper by Strathmore. So plate surface. So texture, it's really important, and it will help you convey what you want to do with your painting. If you're really trying to get texture in that watercolor piece, then don't go for something really smooth. If you're trying to do smooth portraits or smooth sort of whatever you're doing, if it's like an object that's really smooth, don't go for something that's super textured. It's not going to help what you're trying to achieve. So as well as thickness, then look at the surface. So get something quite thick. If you're doing portraits, go for then a thick smooth paper. If you want a bit more texture, go for the rough paper. Like I said, I will be showing examples of what I use, but this is an overall one. If you're going into an art store, you're kind of coming across a whole aisle of papers and paper pads, which can be very overwhelming. This will give you an idea of what to look for. So second thing is texture. Got the thickness down, got the texture. The next thing we want to look at is that is an awful arrow. But the next thing that we want to look at is the actual tone of the paper. So the third one is the tone, or kind of like the colour of the paper. And even if it's white, there can be lots of different types. It can be warm toned white, more creamy white, or more sort of yellowy or more blue sort of whites. There's lots of different types of white. A lot of the times when I get pads of paper, they're not like brilliant white and really bright white like say printer paper is. If I was to quickly compare, if I get one of my sheets, say this one, don't know if you can tell, but this white is a lot sort of bluer than this one. This is more of a cream white. I think the exposure is a bit too high. Let's turn you down a bit. So this is more of a cream white, that's more of a bluey type of white. And so it's important to look at those tones, especially if you want something to be ultra white, especially if it's going directly against a picture frame which has like a mount. I found that a lot of the time when I go to frame a drawing and it's got like part of the paper showing, if you use a white mount against the white paper but the paper's slightly off in tone, it can really make it look yellow. Like having such a white mount, like a brilliant perfect white against your paper that's sort of cream toned, it really makes it look yellow. So when you're paying for your paper and you're going to buy it, make sure you look at what it says. It might say something like bright white, or it might say something like more warm, it might say like warm tone, or like cold white. But just look at it, just look at the paper, open the pad up if you can, some might be sealed, but look at the actual paper, feel the paper for the thickness and the texture, and look at that colour. Are you happy with it? Take a piece of paper with you that you know is this tone that you want to look for. You know, if you've been using a piece of paper and you really like how white it is, take that with you and compare it to the tone of these other papers, because it might be a bit off. Another thing to mention is if you want to go for a different tone entirely, if you don't want a white type of paper. So if you wanted to go for something like this, so a grey toned paper, you need to consider whether you actually do want it to be white, or do you want it to be more grey toned or tan toned paper, or black paper, because these can be really good to draw on because it gives you a mid-tone value. So when you add highlights on top of it, they stand up, you can see the highlights, and then you can add the shadows, whereas with white, you're at the lightest sort of value, you just have to go darker. But with this, you can add the highlights and add the shadows, and it's just more of a mid-tone thing, so you can have the mid-tones in there. And this can be really good if you're using graphite or black and white drawings. If you get a grey-toned piece of paper, it just speeds it up a lot more and can give you really nice three-dimensional looks to it. So I recently bought this pad of paper. This is more warm grey, okay? So this is more of a yellowy sort of warm grey. It's not a blue grey, it's not a cold grey, it's not an iced grey. It's a warm grey. I'd have much preferred a cool grey, but this pad is just more warm toned. So does it say on here? Toned grey, does it specify that it's warm? I don't think it does. It did when I bought it, it said more of a warm grey tone on the actual description. So I knew it was going to be more warm toned grey. But I just wanted something that was a bit more grey compared to my tone tan. But I do want to go for also some cold grey paper as well. But that's something to bear in mind. Do you actually need it to be white, or do you think you should experiment with some other colours? Would they be more beneficial for what you're trying to do? So, okay, we've thought about the thickness, we've thought about the texture, now we've thought about the tone. So all of those things are in our mind when we're picking out our paper. The last thing is, and this is probably one of the most important things if you're actually wanting to sell your work, and that is looking at whether it's archival, acid-free, all of that sort of stuff. So looking at the archival and the acid-free. So what this means is you don't want your paper to discolor over time. If you're selling your drawing and you're selling it for a lot of money, you want to make sure that that drawing stays like that. So you want to use paper that is acid-free and archival so that it doesn't discolor. So your paper, you want your paper not to discolor. So you don't want your paper to discolor over time. That is something that you really don't want. That is the most important thing. So it doesn't matter if you've got all of these things. If your paper isn't going to last, if it's going to discolor quickly, then move on. Get something that's acid free. All of the good brands, the paper that's good quality will be acid free. And again, it should say right on the front. So like here, it will say acid free. Let's look at my other ones. It'll say something like 100% acid free or pure, something to that extent. Again, I'm just looking through these pieces of paper. So again, this one says acid free. Yeah, they all say acid free on them. So that's really important. So those are the 4 things to look for. And I hope that gives you more of an idea when you go into the art store and pick your paper, things that you should look for, because I know it is very overwhelming when you see all of these different drawing pads to know what to get. Another sort of 5th thing to look for is the brand itself. So obviously it doesn't have to be a really well-known brand to be good paper, but I do go for branded papers. I do stick with a brand that I know or a few brands. Like I really like the Arches watercolor paper and I really like the Strathmore paper. I feel like I can trust that the paper is going to be good quality, and I would much prefer to buy paper from those bigger brands that I know are sort of legit rather than brands I've never heard of, because again, I can be pretty confident that when they say it's archival or acid free that it is. And so I do recommend going for the brands like Canson, Strathmore, Arches watercolor paper, and just ones that you've heard of. So another thing is, now let's get into the paper. So that's the next thing I want to do with you guys. So I'm just going to set my focus to automatic. Okay, so the first ones that I want to go through are things that I would use if I wanted to do colour pencil portraits or graphite portraits. So for portrait work, I like to use this one. So this is the Strathmore Bristol paper, and you've seen me use this a lot in all of my colour pencil portraits, but you've seen me use the 500 series one. So this is the 300 series. It's still a good paper, it's just cheaper. It's not, I suppose, as good as the 500 series. So I've got the 500 series here. This one is really expensive, but it is good quality. So again, it says archival quality on it, and that's the plate surface finish. I'm just looking. Okay, so this again is really smooth. It will say smooth surface, which is what we want. We want, when we do portraits, to have again a smooth texture. So that's why I picked this, because it's a smooth texture. Again, I know the brand, I trust the brand, so that makes me trust it more. Another thing was, even though it's, I suppose it is a bit creamier, it's still really, really brilliant white actually. This is a really nice white colour. It's not too yellowy cream. It's not sort of, if I get a piece of paper that is really cream, you'll see the difference. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this is a drawing pad that I got by Strathmore as well, and I don't really like this. I think I used it a couple times, but it was too yellow for me. And you can see that this is much yellower than this paper, and even though it may not look like a massive difference, when this is meant to be white, it is a big difference. Like, this is okay for sketching, but I'd never use this one for complete pieces, because firstly, this is too thin for me. It's really thin, and this is just the drawing pad, whereas this is the much thicker Bristol pad. But it's so yellow, and that's what I mean when you need to look for these sort of things when you buy it. That is yellow, that is much whiter, so look for that. So this is what I use for all my coloured pencil drawings, this or the 500 series, whether that's graphite or coloured pencil. It's thick. It is, what's the grammage of this? it's £100, so 270 GSM, which is really, really good. It's in our sort of category, our range of the GSM and the pound that we sort of accept. So this is really thick, really smooth, nice and white, and it's archival. So it fits into all 4 of these things, and it's suitable for our portrait drawings, as well as that 500 series. So I would use that for graphite and coloured pencil portraits. If I was to do coloured pencil or graphite portraits and it's of animals, I might want to have a bit more texture, or I might just want to use solvent, then I go for this one. So this is the Strathmore Bristol, but instead of being smooth, it is, I'm sorry for the really awkward way I'm holding this, but this is the vellum surface. So that means it's still pretty smooth, but it has a bit more texture to it. It can grip on a bit more to that coloured pencil, and so I love it for layering with solvents. I find that this is a nice paper for that. This is the 400 series, so the middle of the range. It is 2-ply, so it doesn't really say the weight, but 2-ply is nice and thick, and so this is great. The vellum is great if you want to do animals, use solvent, or just something that isn't portraits. You don't need it ultra smooth. You want to kind of have a bit more of a rougher texture so it can really cling on to that coloured pencil. So one problem with the smooth paper is that it might not hold as much coloured pencil. You might not be able to layer as much. So if you don't need to do something super smooth, I would recommend going for the vellum paper. Again, this is Bristol and by Strathmore. So the next thing is this toned paper. So if you want a bit more tone, then I do recommend going for the mixed media paper rather than the sketchbook. So I've used the Tone Tan sketchbook a lot in my YouTube videos, and I love it for sketches, but I don't like it for finished work. I use it just to do my little sketches. So if you want to have finished pieces of work that are thicker, this is 184 pound in weight. This is extremely thick. I'll show you just how thick this is. So this is one piece of paper. You can probably hear by the sound how thick that is. And so this is great for coloured pencil work, graphite work. If you want to have a bit more of a tone, like I said, you can get this in different colours, and you don't have to go for this brand. Just type in toned paper and you will get up some loads of different types. But I really do like to use this sort of thing. This is a vellum surface, so like the other one, it's not super smooth. It's smooth, but it has a bit more grip to it. So it's just got a tiny bit of sort of roughness. It's not like a plate surface all across, like silky. It has a bit more sort of surface to grab onto that pencil. But this is a really great option. And the last few that I recommend is for watercolours. But again, like I said, watercolour paper can be used for loads of different things. And that is the Arches watercolour paper. So I have got this pink one here and a nice green one. So let's do these together. So if you want to do portraits with your watercolours, if you want to do something that you want to keep super smooth, go for the hot press. Go for hot press. Hot press means it's smooth. It means it's nice and compressed. There's not much texture. It's nice and smooth. So hot pressed is great if you want a smooth painting. It's also great, this one, hot pressed watercolour paper, if you want to do coloured pencil work. If you want to do coloured pencil work with solvent, or if you just want to use thicker paper. I would even use this for anything that I wanted to do other than burnishing with a portrait. So if you wanted to do a portrait with something like the solvent method, then I'd use this. So watercolour paper is great for graphite work, it's great for watercolour work, and it's great for coloured pencils. If you wanted to use one piece of paper that could do everything, I'd go for this. If you want something for your watercolours with a bit more texture, then go for the cold press. So let me show you the texture of this. Hopefully, will you be able to see it? Maybe if I get close. I know it's close, but can you see that texture? It's much rougher. and it's got so much more texture than the smooth paper. But this is great when I want to do, say, watercolor animals. I want that paper, I want to have paper where when I do the washes and want to paint wet and wet, it holds on to that water better, so I have more time to paint. So cold press is great if you want to do watercolor work, if you want to work wet and wet. It doesn't soak it up so quick as the hot pressed. And again, these are both really thick. You could use this for charcoal or graphite or anything where you want a bit more texture, but if you don't want as much texture, I'd go for this. So Arches is really good. A lot of people use the Canson paper as well, but I haven't tried that. I've just tried these and I love them. So the last thing I want to mention is that you don't always have to use drawing pads for your drawings. So you could opt for a nice sketchbook. So I recently got this one. I haven't actually used it yet, so I don't know what it would be like. First thing I can spot is that the paper is quite yellow compared to this one, but I'm just going to use this for sketching. So this is a Moleskine sketchbook, very common nowadays with a lot of artists, I've noticed. And this paper is ultra smooth, so it's great for your smooth sketches, graphite, colour pencil, all that sort of stuff. The pages aren't really thin, they're thick enough for your sketches. So if you don't necessarily want to have lots of different single pieces of paper, if you just want to create a collection of drawings and practice your sketches, and you don't want it to just be a whole big sort of masterpiece, then getting a sketchbook is really useful as well. And one of these can be used for all sorts of things. Of course, you can get more watercolor type of sketchbooks, so you have more sort of freedom with using wet mediums and mixed mediums, and so there's lots of different sketchbooks that you can get. But you don't always have to get single pads with single sheets that you rip out. You can go for sketchbooks as well and create a collection of artwork in one place. But that is basically it for how I go about deciding what paper to use. I really hope that helped some of you guys out with deciding what to use when you go into these art stores. But thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next part. Bye everybody!